Good morning everyone, and welcome to this virtual event. My name is Francesco Bosello. I am a professor of economics and environmental economics at the University of Venice. And I'm very glad to welcome you to this session that describes what are the potential trade transmitted effect through the EU economic system conveyed by climate change impact. This work is part of a research project which is called Cascades, is a Horizon 2020 project, and we shall have 5 presentations which are presenting the most important result of this work. And I take the opportunity also to thank Chatham House for hosting this event and this virtual pavilion through their platform. And we are very glad to be able to present this result at COP27. So let me briefly share the screen and give you some more detail about this event. So could you please confirm that you can see my screen? Okay, very good. So as I was mentioning, Cascades is an Horizon 2020 research project. Is almost ending, lasted 4 years. And the main focus of the project is to understand which kind of impacts that are occurring outside the EU can cascade or interact with the EU economic system and produce effects that can be contrasted or should be contrasted by appropriated policies. And the policy implication of this work is also the second more important focus of the research. There are 12 research institutions involved. You see them here, among which Chatham House, which are hosting us. And we are going to focus specifically on what is Work Package 3, which is focusing explicitly on the trade mechanism and supply and value chain impacts. So the session will will be split in 2 main slots. The first one is a more macroeconomic oriented, and there will be 3 presentations. One on the more macroeconomic point of view, one analysis that we developed on trade choke points, and an analysis that refers more to climate change impacts on agricultural markets and agricultural price volatility. And this will be presented by myself from the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, Richard King from Chatham House, and Rania Zatur from the Boston Institute of Climate Research. You can see already some ice-breaking questions because we would like to engage and involve the audience in interacting with us. I will say in a second how this can be possible. We shall have a second slot or session, which is mostly dedicated to the soy and the food markets. And there, Joe Simpson and Emily Stockel from the University of York are going to present some case studies that have been developed by the project. So how can we interact together? So first of all, you are very welcome to raise questions, writing the question on the chat. There will be a chat where you can post your question. You can raise your question in every moment, also during the presentation, but anyway, there will be 2 specific sessions at the end of each slot where the interaction can occur. Also, to warm up, we thought that it could have been nice to have to submit to you some poll questions, so that there will be a pop-up window that at a certain point will appear where you could vote for some multiple choices answer, basically reacting to some specific questions related to the different topic of each session. Okay, so with that said, I would like to start myself for the first presentation, which is mostly related to the analysis that have been done on potential cascading effects for the economic system that are conveyed by climate change impacts on agriculture and climate change impacts on energy demand. Just a word on the methodology that has been followed for this specific study is the application of a macroeconomic model, which is a multi-country, a multi-sector model, and where it has been applied on a combination of different scenarios that melted together climate change futures. And here you see on the figure on the right, the different types of climate scenarios that has been considered by the project, going from the more optimistic, where the temperature stays more or less below the 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, to the more pessimistic, where the temperature increases beyond 4 degrees Celsius at the end of the century. But these climate scenarios have been intersected with social economic scenarios, those which are called SSPs here, the shared social economic pathways. And where you see the circles, those are the combination that have been analyzed. So in particular, considering scenarios where the socioeconomic development is more or less business as usual, like SSP2, to other scenarios where the socioeconomic development is more fragmented, SSP3, or more fossil fuel oriented, the SSP5. So, of course, I'm not going into the detail, but just give you the more important messages that we found with this research. First of all, the information that we used to assess how the impacts can be conveyed through trade mechanism to the EU. So first of all, we need the impacts, and this is the work that has been developed by the Boston Institute of Climate Research, and we have information on what happens or what is projected to happen to yields, crop yields. And basically, you see, especially in the scenarios RCP6, which is presents quite a strong climate signal, quite relevant temperature increase, you see that there are very important negative effects on yields, especially in developing countries, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and small Asian countries. This is for wheat and rice, which are the most important cereal crops, but also other cereals in general are negatively affected. However, in areas that are located at mid-high latitude, like the EU, potential gains in yields could be observed. How this translates in terms of economic impact that can be conveyed to the EU? Eventually, these effects are not very large in terms of GDP impact. So we cannot, will not expect, or the model does not simulate huge economic losses from climate change impacts on yields in the EU economy. And you see here the different regions in the EU, and the losses, when there are losses, are very tiny in terms of GDP. However, it is also interesting, and this is the second important message, that if you compare the red histogram with the green or the blue histogram, and the difference is that in the red, we impose the impacts that just the EU agricultural system would experience. So alone in isolation, and you see that the red is always positive. When we include also the impacts that can occur outside the EU, you see how the green or the blue for almost all the regions in the EU are below zero. So basically, this means that outside impacts outside the EU have a very important effect in transforming those that could have been positive effects into negative effects. So the trade effects in this sense are very, very important, although in a context where losses are moderate. But this is the GDP impacts, where we can show that trade has this important transmission effect, but where everything somehow is smoothed because GDP summarizes somehow everything. If we move at the sectoral level, we can see that losses can be larger depending on the crop and the regions, and that they are effectively losses. Okay, so what happens? It happens that we notice how, in fact, also the agricultural sector in the EU could experience a significant decrease in production. Okay, but what is interesting to note here is that this is not really related by climate change itself, because we just say that yields could improve in the EU, but just by competitive and trade effect. Competitiveness, adverse competitiveness effects, and trade effects. So this also shows how trade at the sectoral level is an important channel that can transmit negative impacts. What is important to stress is that this situation that somehow is, let's say, acceptable or moderately concerning for the EU is much more concerning for developing countries, where the losses are huge, and also these smoothing or trade mechanism effects are not enough to compensate the loss. So there are important redistributional effects. Let me move rapidly to the energy demand analysis. And again, also in this case, we notice basically that what is expected to happen is an increase in the energy demand during the summer, mostly for a cooling effect, and a decrease in the demand for energy in the winter period due to reduced warming needs. And so eventually this has quite important redistributional effect, but not a very important scale effect. So when we look at the sectoral picture, and here we have again the regions in the EU that we analyze, and the different energy commodities and energy intensive commodities production, we see that the picture is very nuanced. So there is not a clear-cut indication here. What is very clear is that we can see a clear increase in energy demand almost everywhere, and a decrease in oil demand. And the oil, in this case, this picture refers to oil production and energy electricity production. Of course, the Europe as an area is not a large producer of energy, with the exception of a few countries like Norway, first of all. So this indication, these indication are referred to small numbers, with the exception of the rest of Europe, where we have Norway and partly the UK. So, but this means that again, the effect of climate change are more redistributional, and indeed, so there will not be problem of energy security, so to say. But exactly because they are redistributional, the cascading effects are quite important. So let me just plot and show you the questions. Let me leave them just for a minute. That of course you are very welcome to raise whatever kind of comments, suggestion that you have, but this could be just to warm up, or also to start to have some thoughts, waiting for the discussion session at the end. At the same time, we should have now the first poll question popping up, where you that you are asked kindly to answer. So let me also stop the share screening, and while I think we should leave 1 minute to answer the question, and in the meantime, I would give the floor to Richard King from Chatham House for his next presentation, which is focused on a very relevant topic, which is the potential effect of disruption or interruption of key trade nodes. But let us wait 30 seconds for people to answer in the poll, and then Richard, the floor is yours. Okay. So perfect. So I think that Richard can start the presentation. In the meantime, we are collecting the results, and I guess I will be able to tell you what happens at the end of Richard's presentation. So.
Okay, thanks, Francesco. Hello, everyone. Yes, so as mentioned, I'm going to focus on the food trade impacts from shocks at choke points. And we think about choke points as sort of particular places on trade routes and in supply chains that are especially important to food trade, and through which outsized impacts can cascade. So if you look at that map in the top right-hand corner, we broadly think about 14 major choke points on which the global trade in staple food, commodities, and fertilizers rely. So as you can see, most of those are sort of littoral or maritime, and there are a few sort of inland pinch points as well in terms of transport networks. And the point about these is really that if we do get a blockage at any of these, then sort of small-scale localized disruptions can really start cascading through global supply chains very quickly if they occur at strategically important locations. And I think 2001, last year, was a prime example of that, where we had the Ever Given container ship blocking the Suez Canal. That was only for 6 days, but each of those days, global trade lost around $10 billion of value. And the Suez is particularly important to global grain trade, as 15% of all global grain trade passes through there. So you can see sort of one boat in a very small, in the wrong location can then start having very significant impacts globally. And of course, we've seen the same more recently in terms of the Black Sea and the blockade on Ukrainian ports, and what the impact that has had on global food prices and the ability to get grain out of that region. In terms of choke point risks, I mean, we kind of think about them in several broad categories. Obviously, weather and climate being an important one, but there's also, obviously, as Ukraine exemplifies, security and conflict as well, and there's sort of also political and institutional risks. But for all of those, climate change is a significant risk multiplier. So our analysis is focused particularly on what might the impact be to the EU in terms of trade impacts through choke points. And as you can see in this heat map, the EU is actually less dependent on the choke points that we identify than the world as a whole. So about 18% of global imports come into or 80% of the value of global imports come into the EU. And of those, about 26% transit a choke point, and that's compared with 56% globally. So less dependent on routes that transit choke points than the world as a whole. And if you look at the maps on the right-hand side, the top of which is cereal imports and the bottom is soybean imports, you can see for soybean in particular, that's because a lot of it is coming out of the Americas, and a lot of that comes out of the East Coast. So in terms of getting across the Atlantic, there's not really much of an impediment to that trade flow. For cereals, it's slightly more of a problem, as cereal imports have come through the Black Sea and particularly from the Far East, sort of transiting up through the Suez Canal. And then the heat map on the top left shows the sort of relative dependencies on these different choke points that we identify for the EU and the world as a whole. And of the two which are most concerned to the EU, the Dover Strait between England and France and the Strait of Gibraltar between Morocco and Spain, those are the most sort of important ones. But as the EU is sort of a littoral state, is it sort of borders directly those choke points, they have a lot more control over the passage through there than some of the more globalized ones. So we focused our analysis on the next most important ones, which are the Panama Canal, the Turkish Straits, and the Suez Canal. I should also say that the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb at the southern end of the at the southern end of the Red Sea, a lot of the trade that comes from the east goes through both that and the Suez Canal. So the exposure to that is very similar to Suez. So as a result, we just focused on Suez for our analysis. In terms of the approach we used, we basically coupled some analysis of choke point routes that Chatham House has done before and coupled that with the macroeconomic model that Francesco's institute is responsible for. The same model that he mentioned earlier. And we basically looked at sort of acute shocks to specific choke points that we think could potentially materialize in any future climate scenario. So because they are very extreme events, they could equally happen now as they could under sort of very severe climate impacts in 2050. So they're not necessarily scenario dependent in and of themselves. And we look at them sort of independently, so we don't look at sort of a blockage to Suez and Panama together, but tackle them separately. And in terms of the sort of different simulations that we consider, our reference case uses SSP2. So this is in terms of how the impacts sort of cascade, not the impact at the choke point itself. SSP2 is a middle of the road scenario, and we look at that in 2030, but using sort of current trade dependencies, different countries' reliance on imports from different countries. And then we supplement that with some more detailed analysis, which looks at both 2030 and 2050. And then we also build out the scenario assumptions. So SSP2 again, but also with the climate forcing, high climate forcing of RCP6. And then SSP3, which is a much more regional rivalry, much more trade restricted world. And again, look at that under two different climate scenarios, both a lower impact one under RCP 2.6 and under RCP 6.0. And of course, the climate forcing obviously affects the production yields as well as the trade shocks, as Francesco mentioned in his presentation. So in terms of the specific shocks, we considered these three choke points: Panama, Turkish Straits, and Suez Canal. And this is sort of the narrative background to how we are conceptualizing them. And these are all based on historical precedents that we've witnessed before, and the years are given in the italicized red there. So under the Panama Canal, we imagine there could be a strong El Nino event, could result in dry weather in Central America, which could lead to sort of very low water levels in the lakes either side of the Panama Canal, which means the vessel depth restrictions are imposed because the water is very low, so you can't get larger ships through and you can't carry as much on any given ship. And so our assumption is that 53% of annual agricultural trade throughput would be affected under this scenario. For the Turkish Straits, we envisaged a re-escalation of the Syrian conflict. So this is more a sort of conflict-driven scenario than a climate one, although sort of perceiving that climate could sort of re-escalate the conflict. And this could develop into a sort of proxy conflict between Turkey and Russia, and then Turkey could block the Turkish Straits as a result. And we saw sort of similar incidents in 2015-16. And under this assumption, around 12% of the throughput will be affected. This scenario was conceived before the Ukraine conflict erupted earlier in this year, but obviously, you could see very similar effects from that scenario as well. And then finally, the Suez Canal. This is sort of drawing on precedents that we saw last year, as I mentioned, but also in previous years in 2010 and 2015, where you can get amplified jet stream, increasingly strong storm surges and sandstorms, and that will both sort of make the canal unnavigable, but could also conceivably lead to infrastructure damage at the port at the southern end of the Suez Canal. And again, under this assumption, around 12% of the throughput of agricultural products would be affected. So as background, across all of those three choke points, around 38%, 40% of agricultural trade passes through them. If you look at that on a commodity basis, rice has both the lowest exposure to those specific choke points and has the lowest trade value. Panama Canal is the most significant choke point, especially for oil seeds, obviously coming out of Latin America. And for wheat and other cereals, the dependencies are more evenly distributed. And then if we look at direct risks in 2030 from those disruptions, the Panama disruption we can see will be much more significant than the other two, both in terms of the trade value that's passing through it and the magnitude of the envisaged shock. So 10% of global agricultural trade as opposed to 1% for the other two shocks. But it's worth saying that for those countries which are directly import dependent on trade that passes through there, that could still be a significant impact. Turning to sort of results for Europe, particularly in terms of food prices, this is obviously mediated by sort of international commodity co-integration, sort of price transmission across borders. But in terms of price impact in the EU, and remember these are annualized prices rather than sort of acute price shocks, they're small absolute changes for the EU. So in the Panama Canal shock, we generally see food price increases for the food commodities and the food industry in Europe. That's especially true for wheat and grains. And regionally, that's especially true for the Mediterranean and northern EU, despite their limited direct exposure to the Panama Canal. For the other two shocks in the Turkish Straits and Suez Canal, we see smaller price increases, and we generally see price decreases, especially after the Suez event for wheat. And that's, we think, because you could envisage a EU production response, assuming that sort of the climate is conducive to that you might see sort of EU domestic production ramping up as a result of decreased import availability. In terms of the food industry output, so this is sort of economic activity in the sector that is dependent on these food crops. Again, relatively small changes in Europe, and they're generally negative. That's similar across the rest of the world, other than in the Americas, where we see sort of positive impacts in Argentina and Canada particularly. For the Turkish shock, we see little change except in the Black Sea countries, which are generally negative but positive for Ukraine. And in the Suez shock, we see very small positive impacts in Europe, and the most negative impacts are in the Middle East and North Africa, which are obviously very dependent on that routing. I mentioned that we looked at several different scenarios, so just to kind of briefly cover how the impacts change between the different RCPs and SSPs and the different time horizons. Generally, across all of the scenarios, the impacts are quite small in terms of price impacts, and quite similar to the reference case I've just outlined. But in terms of economic impacts, they're generally larger in 2050 compared with 2030. And they're generally higher under the high climate forcing RCP6 scenario compared with the more climate benign 2.6 scenario. And that obviously includes sort of yield impacts as well from production, as well as the trade impacts. The effects under SSP3, which remember is sort of a much more regionalized, less open trade scenario than SSP2, are lower, but that's because there's generally a less overall international trade anyway. So you're starting from a sort of more fragmented base point. And generally across all of the scenarios, the largest economic losses are in the net exporting countries, especially Argentina affected by Panama shock, Canada from the Panama and Suez shocks, and for all of the shocks, Ukraine sees large economic losses. So in summary, of all the shocks that we looked at, the Panama shock has the most significant direct impacts on global agricultural trade. Within Europe itself, the price impacts from all three shocks are of a similar magnitude. That's despite limited direct exposure to the Panama canal, and we're seeing sort of impacts of indirect price transmission there. The EU food industry is relatively lightly affected compared with other regions. Agricultural importers generally experience increases in prices, and that translates into higher prices and lower production from domestic food industries that are dependent on those food commodities as inputs. And generally, we see a domestic agricultural production response in importing regions to compensate for their loss of imports. But again, that's only possible if the climate is conducive to that. So that may not be a possibility if some of these sort of climate impacts are sort of a more significant global magnitude. And again, worth re-emphasizing that we're talking here about annualized changes, and that obviously understates the sort of acute disequilibrium impacts and sort of downstream impacts, disruptions that we might see in the shorter term. So I think all of that is to say that these are significant risks, even if the annualized impacts are not huge. I think if you look at recent events, both in terms of the Suez blockage and the Ukrainian war, that sort of, these choke points remain incredibly critical to food trade. And I think all of that suggests that probably there needs to be more policy focus in terms of addressing these potential impacts and considering some of the different mitigations that we might require as a response. So I will finish there and hand it back to Francesco. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. And let me say that I would be very interested in knowing our audience opinion about, especially if there is something particularly surprising from these results, or surprisingly unsurprising. So something of this type, of this kind of comments. Let me say that now there should be also the possibility to answer to the second poll that should be pop up related to let's say the theme of choke points. But in the meantime, let me also tell you the result of the first poll. So which of these scenarios relating to food do you find the most concerning? And the majority voted for an unfair distribution between countries. So that definitely won the prize of the most voted answer, followed by the potential significant rationing in the EU and increasing prices in the EU. But the two are somehow one is the dual of the other, because higher prices mean lower quantity. So these 2 points. Interestingly, the unfair distribution between households within countries didn't receive a lot of, is not perceived as a concerning issue. Perhaps because also the EU is considered quite developed countries where this kind of dynamics or tension could be lowered. So, okay, so I see that the second poll is going on. So in the meantime, I will pass the floor and the virtual microphone to Rania for her presentation. Rania from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research, and her presentation is on, again, on the agricultural trade and commodities. In particular, the focus will be on more, price effects.
Thank you, Francesco. Hello, everyone. My name is Rania Zatur. I'm a postdoc at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And today I have the pleasure to present for you the preliminary results of our ongoing analysis of food grain global prices volatility. Our main goal is to answer the following question: how would the future global grain prices vary in response to climate change, whether be it in comparison to historical prices or in comparison to the production. To answer this question, we'll be using data from EasyMap. This framework projects the impact of climate change across different sectors, and we're interested in the agricultural sector. In this sector, EasyMap combines data from or input from different crop models and climate models under different scenarios, namely the socioeconomic, sensitivity, and climate scenarios. Among different variables, EasyMap will generate yield or crop yields that we process in order to produce to generate the global annual production for each crop we're interested in. These production are next fed to TWIST, which is short for trade with storage. This is a pricing model that takes in a global annual production, a global annual consumption, and the beginning storage in order to estimate the global annual prices of different crops. So, as the title of this presentation precised, we are interested in analyzing how these global annual prices will vary in the future. And to do so, we'll be using the coefficient of variation, which is an indicator of the variability of a given population around its mean. You just have to note that a higher coefficient of variation corresponds to higher variability in the data. In the results I'll be showing next, I will be comparing the coefficient of variation of the future data minus the coefficient of variation of historical data. And if the results are positive, it means that we have a higher variability in the future. And if results are negative, that means that we have a lower variability in the future. Moving on to results, we'll be comparing results from different rounds of EasyMap, namely EasyMap 2B and 3B, along with different climate models and different crop models. Let's start with EasyMap 2B. These are results from wheat under RCP 6.0. To the left, we have the production, and to the right, we have the prices. In both cases, we are comparing the future simulated data to the historical simulated data. And the results are color-coded by crop model. So each color corresponds to a crop model, and within each crop model, we have different climate models. So here we can see a global negative tendency, meaning that the production and the prices will vary less in the future than they do in the historical periods. We can also observe that some climate model have more pronounced impacts on the results, like the second climate model, making the production always very less in the future. However, this impact doesn't always follow suit. As you can see here, the second climate model doesn't yield the least variation in the future prices. Moving on to results from soybeans, still under RCP 6.0, we can see here that some climate and crop model combination estimate production and prices to vary more in the future than they do in the historical period. We observe that the direction of change is mainly depends on the choice of crop models. As you can see, there's like a pattern of going up and then down, always down for LPGML, and then up and down for PEPIC. And this trend follows in the prices. So we can, from these two results, we can take notes that overall simulated wheat production and prices will vary less in the future, and that this applies also to the soybean, with the exception of 1/3 of the crop climate model combination, which shows that production and prices will vary more in the future than they do in the historical periods. Moving on to results from EasyMap 3B, this is the more recent round of EasyMap runs. And as you can see, first thing to notice here is that we have a lot more of climate models and crop model combinations. And contrary to what we've seen with EasyMap 2B, where wheat production and prices, seem to always vary less in the future, here we have more combinations that estimate production, which is shown above, and prices, which are below, to vary more in the future than they do in the historical period. We can also observe that the magnitude of variation that's observed in the future is considerably higher than the variability observed in the historical periods. As you can see here, production and prices variability reaches 15% in terms of coefficient of variation, which translates into a dramatic level of volatility. For example, if we take this case under the Grover model, this translates into this price time series where prices not only get higher, but you can see that the variability of these prices are very important. Let's take another example under LDNDC. This almost 15% in terms of coefficient of variation translates into this variability in the future period, which is highlighted by the gray background. Interesting enough is that not only some crop models always expect prices and production to vary more in the future, but some models like this one in orange, for example, the LPJML, always expect production and prices to vary less in the future. And what's more remarkable is that in some cases, we have a higher variability of the production in the future, but a lower variability of the prices in the future. So the variability doesn't always follow from the production variability. Moving on to results for soybean, still under the RCP 8.5. So here again, we have different models that expect production and prices to vary less in the future, and some other expect them to vary more in the future. And here we have a very, very high magnitude of variability, reaching more than 40% for the production and reaching 20% for the production, which translates into a very high volatility. If we take this example under the sigma 1P74, this translates into this price time series. You can see that in the future prices get very high, and the volatility is very, very important. And we can take this another example under ESAM, for example. And again, we observe the same trend of prices going high and of very large spikes, So from these results under ESAMIP 3B, we observed that respective 33% and 57% of the combination showed that wheat and soybean prices will vary more in the future. And according to some of these crop models, prices will have a dramatic level of volatility. Let's move to our last set of results. In these results, we are counting the number of extreme price events per 100 years. And again, we are comparing the number of these extreme events in the future compared to the historical periods. So we can see here that with the Grover and with the LDNDC crop models, we will be having more price extreme events in the future than we did in the historical periods, and these events might be as more as 25 events per 100 years. And still, as we observed with the production and the prices, some models also expect that we won't be having as much extreme price events in the future, and as the production and prices will be less variable in the future, also the number of extreme events will be less in the future, as is the case with the orange model LPGMR or with the blue model PEPEC. If we check now the results, the same results for soybean under RCP 8.5, we also see that some models expect more extreme events in the future and some other models expect less extreme events in the future. However, what's really interesting to notice compared to the results we had with the wheat case is that more model crop and climate model combination expect a higher number of extreme price events in the future. So keynotes from this set of results is that respective 48 and 58% of the combination estimate more extreme price events for wheat and soybean in the future. And these extreme price events are up to 20 and 25 more events per 100 year for respective cases of wheat and soybean. So we've seen some models expecting a higher variability and more extreme events in the future, some other model expecting less, some prices that does not follow the same direction or magnitude of variability from production. And in face of all these mixed results, one would ask themselves, what conclusions should we draw? So let me remind you that in the more recent set of results coming from the ESMIP 3B, we've observed substantial increases in price variability by 5 to 20% in coefficient of variation, and that we're expecting 8 to 25 more extreme price events per 100 years. And these results were found in 8 out of 42 climate crop model combination for wheat and in 13 out of 52 climate crop model combination for soybean, which should not be considered as mere outliers. However, this should be considered as a non-negligible risk and a reason for concern about food price crisis. In fact, in face of large uncertainty, a risk perspective seems advisable as countries with strong import dependencies and low economic resources, such as countries located in Africa, West Asia, or Central America, would be most at risk of domestic food price crisis. So what would be advisable? In fact, we advise to consider no or low regrets measures to prevent or at least prepare for such crises, to invest in emergency reserves, preparedness measures, and early warning systems, and to strengthen local food supply system. Thank you. Back to you, Francesco.
Okay, thank you, Rania. Very interesting. I shouldn't say that, but I'm sure that also our audience found your presentation very interesting. So I would ask our audience to forget all that Rania said, because they have now to answer the third poll question related to Rania presentation. But after the I'm curious to see what our public audience will say, because it is exactly the question was exactly meant to basically test the risk aversion of our attendees. Okay, with this said, I think that we have more or less 10 minutes for the interaction, because I don't want to eat the time to the next slot. So you are before, sorry, very important. I would like also to tell you the exit of the previous poll that was meant to highlight what should be the next choke point analysis, basically. So what are the sensible or the sensitive points, and we have with the 50% preferences. Our audience would like to see investigated the issue of intermediates or semiconductor or rare earth material, 40% energy, and 10% other food or perishable fruit, vegetable, animal products, and so on and so forth. So I would say that definitely energy and other strategic material or intermediates are sparkling the interest compared to food, also because we investigated a lot of food issues. Okay, so now in these 7 minutes, you are very welcome to raise questions to our audience, to our presenters. You are also kindly asked to answer the poll, and again, to break the ice, we also have 2 additional poll questions which are more general to spur a little bit the interaction and the discussion. On my side, I just throw on the table the issue if there is really something that was really surprising or unexpected from the presentation that you have heard. So let us see if something appears on the chat or okay. In the meantime, we have already the result of the third poll that was meant to test the uncertainty aversion. And I would say that, so Rania, you've been very convincing, because 67% of our audience says that they would ask for more ambitious climate action. So even facing the uncertainty, this is an additional motivation to be more cautious. So that's definitely good. Also in the context of a COP27. So I would say that there is some kind of self-selection of the sample that I guess that the people are quite environmentally and climatic aware, but this is anyway comforting. And 0% say that less ambitious climate action would be appropriate. 33% say that the position is not really influenced by scientific uncertainty. Okay, so I guess that also the other polls popped up. I can't see them, but okay. Questions are in the chat. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Here are okay. It's just a different windows. Okay. Okay. Here we have I'm picking up one question by Hans Martin Füssel. Exactly. So this is, I think, a very important question. So that in general, so this is open question for everyone. So that the price impacts of the various shocks investigated seems to be very small. In general, less than 1%. How does this relate to the much higher price impact for agricultural commodities, for instance, caused by the Russian war on Ukraine? So how can we, so this is all open to everyone. I think that Richard already mentioned something. Perhaps you would like to expand a little bit more. Then Rania, and then I will reserve myself the last comment. Unless Richard and Rania already touched part of the answer.
Thanks. I mean, I think you're right. I think they are very small price impacts, but I think that's partly because we're looking at, in the case of the choke points, price impacts. They were quite acute events. So the Panama one lasted for 6 months, but the other two lasted for just 2 months or 6 weeks. So when you look over an annualized period, obviously that dilutes the impact. So over a much shorter period, I think you'd see much higher magnitude disequilibrium impacts than those annualized ones. But yeah, let me reserve space for Francesco to speak about actually how the model interprets price impacts. But I think the other thing to say is, as important as the impact is, as the magnitude is the directionality. So seeing whether prices increase or decrease is also an important part of the signal.
Rania, would you like to add something?
Sorry?
No, would you like to add something or?
No, but I could answer the question asked by Hattie.
Okay, so let me also add just that was the next absolutely.
Okay.
just to say that that is absolutely correct. What we have also to consider is that in our modeling exercises we are able to consider rerouting. So in the case of Ukraine, we had a real stop of a very important part of in particular cereal trade, which was abrupt, and we had the short-term effect on prices. In a model that works on a yearly time period, there is the possibility to see the redistribution of routing and also of providers. So there is enough time to adjust. But this is this short price effect is indeed effect. One point to highlight is that anyway we are talking about real prices, which is the model works with the real prices. So in fact, we should add to those prices also other inflationary effect. And if this would be done, you would have seen also larger prices. Anyway, smaller than those that have been experienced. And this is the difference between the reality and what a model can do, basically. So Rania, now if you want to answer to the question. Also summarize, because I don't know if all our audience knows or can read the question that has been posed.
Yeah, so Hetty was asking about the preparedness measures or no regret measures I mentioned in my conclusion. She was asking for examples, and I would suggest to invest in emergency reserves or in early warning system, or also investing in strengthening local food supply system in order to avoid eventual price crisis.
Oh. Okay, there is another question. So, Rania, your presentation raised a lot of interest. There is another question for you, which is related to the scenarios. And yes. So you can read it, but I will read it for our audience. Regarding the scenarios that peak run, was the lesser availability in water during cereal growth season taken into account? It is, I think, a key point related to the answer or the reaction of crop models. So,
well, that was if that's included already in the climate and crop models, then it's considered. But we didn't add something to specifically consider the lesser availability of water. So it's already included in the. I think it's already included in the ISME protocol.
Okay. Okay, let me just let me see if we have also some the exit of the other polls. Okay, we have one question that was the number 4 was, in terms of transmitting climate impacts, which of these could have the biggest impact on the EU? Okay. And we know that despite the situation that we are experiencing now with the difficulties in getting gas from Russia, for instance, changes in energy demand 0. Changes in production of agricultural commodities 25%, interruption of key trade nodes 75%. So Richard, definitely you needed to develop a research on intermediate trades, because this is the most concerning issue, and also the most relevant type of trade which raised concerns by our audience. Okay, we have already the fifth poll result, which is which policy area should be the focus for the EU in tackling cascading climate risks. So this was meant to elicit the strategic area of intervention from our audience. And not surprisingly, climate action in the first place, 60%, and trade and investment policy, 40%. So the other didn't receive didn't receive a vote, basically. So with that said, I think we can now move to the second part of last but not least, of course, part of the presentation and the session. And so I'm giving now the floor to. By the way, let me say that a question could still be raised, and we are reading them, and we can also take the advantage of the next and the final session to ask or involve all the presenters. But let me now give the floor to the University of York team that are going to present their investigation on case studies. And I guess that the first is Joe.
Yes.
And so Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesca. I'll just share my screen. Right, can everyone see this? Yeah, all good, cool. Okay, right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Joe Simpson. I'll be presenting some information, some findings on the agricultural case study that was part of the work package 3 under the Cascades project. And the researchers that contributed to this work were Chris West, Rianne Ebry, and myself, Joe Simpson. Okay, so what were the research objectives for this work? So they were to gather information from stakeholders linked to overseas and trade-mediated climate-linked shocks affecting the EU food system, responses and mitigation measures that are addressing cross-border climate risk, and the practices of actors in supply chains and public policy that mitigates or exacerbate climate risk. Okay, so what was the methodological approach we took? So we have conducted 13 semi-structured interviews so far, but we intend the number of interviews to be much more than that. And from the transcripts of those interviews, we conducted an inductive thematic analysis. So this involved taking relevant text extracts, sorting them into themes, and then taking those themes and organizing them into a coherent narrative, which I'll present today. So the stakeholders that we talked to came from a variety of sectors. So from the private sector, we had supermarkets and distributors. The public sector, we had government officials and policymakers, and then international organizations from trade, governance, and policy institutes. Okay, so the analysis output, as I mentioned before, were these themes, these categories. We had a total of 13 themes, most of which aligned with the interview questions that we asked the stakeholders, but some of them emerged throughout the analysis. So today I'll be taking you through the most important themes and points, but it's important to emphasize that these are preliminary studies. So the information that we've gained, we've yet to verify and explore in detail, and that the data, the text extracts that I'm going to talk about today are the opinions and views of stakeholders, so not the researchers themselves. Okay, so first of all, first theme, what did stakeholders deem were the current problems facing supply chains at the moment? So the first is that the current just-in-time delivery system has left many countries with a lack of strategic reserves, making their supply chains vulnerable to shocks. The second was that many countries are using their resources inefficiently due to poor policy design and a lack of adaptive capacity, which is reducing their resilience to any climate shocks. The third is that governments prioritize their own domestic interests in crises. So, for example, instituting export restrictions, which can further exacerbate supply issues. And last, from the private sector, private companies are just naturally short-term thinkers, and due to the huge number of supply chains they're working with, mitigating any risks in their supply chains can be very time-consuming. Okay, so a theme that came up was the impact of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So what sort of impacts did those two events have? Firstly, global supply tightness, as we're seeing at the moment. It's demonstrated the link between geopolitics, food, energy, and climate mitigation goals. Possibly a silver lining is that it's placed supply chain vulnerabilities and risk on the policy agenda. Next, it's made the EU aware of its own internal resilience. So not so much in the energy domain, where we've seen quite large issues, but in the food domain, the EU as a bloc hasn't been as affected as other countries. And then in the private sector, it's actually demonstrated that companies have an ability to switch their supply chains very quickly, which has minimized some of the potential negative impacts we could have seen if trade was a lot less flexible than it is. So what did stakeholders deem were the key vulnerabilities to the EU food system? Well, firstly, it's important to note that stakeholders reminded us that the EU is quite strongly reliant on many commodities, which other presenters have talked about, so cereals, for example. But the EU is highly dependent on certain imports for soy, for livestock feed, tea, coffee, tropical fruit, palm oil, and fertilizers. And these imports could be vulnerable to climate-driven disruptions, as mitigation measures in the sourcing countries for those commodities still remains inefficient and inadequate. Okay, so what's the EU doing at the moment, and what does it plan to do in the future to address these types of risks to their supply chains? Well, currently, there's agencies in the EU and Rome from the FAO that monitor and share analysis of agricultural markets and climate events to act as an early warning system. And then in the future, many of you may have seen that this year, the EU started to release communications and policy plans on this type of area, calling for supply diversification and reduced import dependence. And then at the bottom there, we have a quote from one of the stakeholders that said the EU is actually quite ahead of the curve in many ways concerning these types of issues. Okay, so what were the consequences of a shock event? Well, what did stakeholders think would potential consequences of a shock event be? Well, it's important to note that generally there was a sense of uncertainty about the outcomes, responses, and impacts of climate change, of supply chain shocks, sorry. So people generally weren't quite sure. But the suggestions we did receive on a short-term basis, we might see that the EU would observe temporary shortages, but not an absolute scarcity, because supply chains are resilient in the long run. We might see a rise in consumer prices, which would impact or could impact affordability, and this impact would be unevenly spread across society and across EU member states. And then in the long term, this is, I think, quite an interesting one, is it could catalyze protectionism. So the developing countries, some developing countries may move their growth model away from exports to sort of insulate themselves from propagating future global shocks, particularly in agricultural markets. And then the types of a comment on the types of responses that we might see. Someone noted that the policy responses to shock events are often more damaging than the initial shocks themselves. So we see cascading trade restrictions, like was observed in the 2008 to 9 food crisis. And then lastly, the comment about how if the EU did just use its fiscal power as quite a rich trading bloc and throw money around, was the quote that a stakeholder used, this could actually damage the UK's global reputation if it's seen to prioritise its own domestic population instead of cooperating with other maybe less rich countries. And then finally, to finish on a slightly more positive note, what were some of the ideas that stakeholders gave us to develop more resilient supply chains related to the EU? Well, firstly, it was important to note that, or it is important to note that lots of supply chains have different levels of integration, so we need to take a tailored approach to each commodity. There's no one size fits all solution. And then there was an idea about turning the just-in-time delivery system to a just-in-case delivery system, so having lots of redundancy, strategic reserves, a diverse set of supply regions. And then maybe controversially, number 3 here, that the EU could influence exporting countries' policy by refusing to engage with countries that aren't instituting climate mitigation measures. And then finally, at the bottom, this is a quote from an individual from the private sector, said, if policy interventions from the EU are too disruptive, this could actually be damaging and decrease the competitive competitivity of EU companies. So that's something to be aware of. And then finally, just some main takeaways for you at the end of the presentation. So geopolitics and political economy clearly play a large role in policy addressing climate risk. The EU is mostly insulated from external climate-driven shocks to food systems, although not completely, of course. Next would be the future shocks are just expected to increase global instability. Current action is inadequate in this area, both in the public and private sector. But on a positive note, resilience to cross-border climate risk is moving up the policy agenda. So that's a positive to take away from the research so far. So I would say thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions. You've got anything surprising, anything particularly interesting that you'd like me to expand on. And with that, I'll pass over to my colleague, Emily, to discuss the soy case study. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Just a second, Emily. I just want to tell our audience to stay with us, of course, because there is your presentation and discussion, but also because we are going to reopen the last poll, because not everyone had the chance to vote on the best policy award, let's say, and then this will be, they will have the possibility at the end of your presentation. So now, sorry, Emily, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I should be sharing my screen now. So yeah, I'm Emily Stokels, and I also work at the Stockholm Environment Institute, based at the University of York. And I'm going to share a few results from our case study on soy. So firstly, why soy? So we wanted to select a more specific case study, so we could look at cross-border climate change impacts in a specific example of commodity trade. And to look at how potential shocks could affect the different stakeholder groups in the supply chain. And soy was chosen because the majority of the soy used in the EU is imported. So the EU is quite import dependent for soy. And we decided to narrow this a bit further by looking specifically at the Brazil to EU soy supply chain, because Brazil is the largest exporter of soy to the EU. And so we were looking at two research questions within this work. So firstly, what are the consequences of supply chain shocks for different stakeholders? And secondly, how can stakeholders adapt to climate-related and other shocks? So the preliminary results I will share in the next few slides are based just on 15 initial interviews with stakeholders from across the soy supply chain. And we're still in the process of conducting more interviews. So what I will present today are just the initial findings. And so far, we've spoken to the groups in the diagram here. So soy producers, people involved in seed and inputs for soy production, grain traders, NGO representatives, EU policymakers, feed producers, poultry producers, and retailers. So moving on to the initial findings. So on the left here is the stakeholder mapping for this piece of work. And it also highlights that we're really just looking at a snapshot of the supply chain. So the full supply chain would include many more countries and stakeholders. And the first thing to mention is that for soy, there are 3 major producers responsible for approximately 80% of total global production of soy. And so you have Brazil, the US, and Argentina. And interviewees gave differing opinions on whether this is Brazilian or not. So it's a small number of countries, just 3, but they do include a large area of soy planted area and different regions of the world. However, there are differences between soy producing countries, and so they're not completely interchangeable, for example, on things like the use of GM crops or protein content of the soy. Secondly, in terms of impacts of a harvest loss on soy farmers, and this can depend on the characteristics of the farm. So soy farmers typically sell approximately 60% of their expected harvest in advance. And if a weather shock causes a loss in harvest, meaning that they're unable to meet their pre-agreed contracts, soy farmers could face a range of different outcomes. So they might be asked to pay a fine, they might face court, they might take on debt, or be forced to buy soy from other farmers to fulfill that contract. Or they might have their contract rolled over to the next year. So these are just a range of things that could happen. And the choice of option might depend also on the characteristics of the farmer and how large or small they are. And the impact on them also depends on how widespread the harvest failure is and what the price of soy is at that particular moment. So in Brazil, farmer insurance is currently little used, and that's mainly because it's too expensive. And finally, there were really varying levels of optimism in technology. So several options were put forward, such as seed technology, soil technology, storage and irrigation. And these are all things which could help soy production in the face of climate shocks. And then in terms of intermediaries, so these are actors such as grain traders or those involved in the transport of soy. Interviewees mentioned that there could be potential opportunities or benefits for this group in the case of a shock. So a climate shock might reduce soy supply and therefore increase soy prices. And so this could, in some cases, be beneficial for traders. However, where traders are at risk is the potential impacts of climate change on the transport of soy. So traders might have to estimate future transport costs when they sell soy in advance. And if transport costs rise, this could lead to additional costs for traders. And this also links to the distinction between considering shocks to supply and shocks to price. So some interviewees were most concerned about disruption to the supply of soy, where the other interviewees were mostly concerned by the increase in soy prices. And especially this is the case for stakeholders where it's difficult to pass on increases in costs down the supply chain. And another interesting point here is that we see a dominance of a small number of big traders. And some interviews said that this might be a result of previous shocks, as only large traders are able to withstand shocks. Okay, so moving on to the feed sector and the consumer end. So for feed producers, a rise in feed costs can lead to big impacts. because in the example of chicken production, feed costs represent approximately 70% of the cost of producing chicken. So furthermore, soy is also a really important ingredient in livestock feed. It's chosen for its good protein content, and there aren't many alternatives at the moment, although there is a lot of research into those alternative protein sources. And again, in the example of chicken, replacing soy would require quite a lot of preparation because, for example, chicken breeds are bred to be optimized for soy feed at the moment. Something else which came up in the interviews is that other inputs to feed are also quite important. So, for example, amino acids and vitamins. And whilst a smaller volume of these are required for feed, their cargo is more concentrated. So if there was just one shipment of vitamins or amino acids disrupted, this could lead to a bigger impact than a shipment of soy being disrupted. Interviewees also mentioned that retailers hold a lot of power. So similar to grain traders, there's a small number of large retailers. And as a result of this good bargaining power in the supply chain, retailers feel less of an impact, potentially in the case of a soy price increase. And some interviewees also mentioned this relative wealthiness of EU consumers, suggesting that they could deal with a rise in the price of soy and implying that it's important to be aware of impacts across the world and also the differences between consumers within the EU. And so finally, just a few points for policymaking for these risks. Currently, not many stakeholders had any plans currently in place for climate-related soy supply chain shocks. And we're just starting to see internal conversations about climate risk to these supply chains, but yeah, not really concrete plans at the moment. Interviewees raised the importance of food compared to other commodities as well, suggesting that maybe we should treat the supply chain differently. And new risks arising from adaptation were also mentioned in the interviews. So, for example, this could be farmers adapting with genetically modified crops. It could also mean that if importers are sourcing soy differently, they might be exposed to riskier regions and they might take riskier decisions. And if soy prices rise as a result of shocks, that might lead to an expansion of soy production into areas of high biodiversity, for example. There were also different perceptions around the role of trade as a solution during shocks. So some suggest that open trade will balance things out and ensure that there are minimal consequences further down the supply chain. And these stakeholders promoted the idea of keeping flexibility in the supply chain where possible and ensuring that there's a lack of import tariffs. But this was countered by a view that we should be increasing domestic production where possible, encouraging food sovereignty and lessening dependence on international trade. This debate of increasing trade and increasing domestic production is a tension that came up in several interviews, and the solution might be a combination of both approaches. So these were the initial insights from the soy supply chain interviews. And if you're interested, please sign up to the Cascades Project newsletter or follow the Cascades Project on Twitter, and you'll see the inputs that will come out from both sets of interviews early next year, hopefully. And yeah, of course, I would be really happy to hear your comments and your feedback on what you've heard so far. So I'll stop sharing my slides. And yeah, we can open it up for questions. Unless, Francesco, do you want to go back to the poll first?
Now the poll test will be popping up, so we will need some 5 minutes, let's say, to collect all the answers and the report. Now, in the meantime, thank you for the presentation, Emily. I will open the floor for discussion. Again, the chat is open for questions. To break the ice, I have myself a question, comments very quick, and the question. The comment is that I found quite comforting correspondence between what the stakeholder says and also the results from our analysis, because we also show that also quantitatively with model, the EU is quite resilient to that type of impact that could affect the food, food production. There will not be really issues of food security. hopefully. At the same time, so that was the comment. Being a modeler myself, I'm happy that sometimes we find correspondence between models and reality. But the question is a little bit provocative. I don't know if you can answer this. But so in the end, all the criticism of the common agricultural policy in the EU were not really well posed, because that eventually made ourselves quite independent upon let's say a too open trade with other countries that would have specialized too much our production. So that this is just a provocative question. What you would say?
Yeah, I can go first, and if you have comments, Joe, as well afterwards. I think, yeah, I think this is an interesting point, because I think the interviews were quite split. Kind of, as I said at the end of my presentation, there's kind of a tension between wanting to completely depend on production within Europe or the EU, and other interviewees who were kind of more pro trying to keep as much international trade as possible. So I think there's still debate within the interviewers that I've been speaking to, from my perspective. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, I'll just echo the comments you said, and then just add, it's actually interesting that the stakeholders we've talked to haven't really talked that much about the common agricultural policy, which is quite interesting. Maybe in future interviews it will come up. But yeah, definitely we've observed the same sort of tension between focusing on domestic production versus being open to free trade. So yeah, I'll just echo those sentiments.
Okay, thank you. So we have one question again for this is addressed to Joe, but I think that also Emily could reply. That is, what might moving from just in time to just in case look like in practice? Does the US have the regulatory tools to act on this? So is there the regulatory framework? Is there a regulatory framework ready for that?
So on the
sorry, Joe, perhaps you may translate perhaps to non-expert what is just in time to just in case.
Yeah,
for those who are listening to us.
So yeah, the just-in-time delivery system sort of describes a pure open free trade model where surpluses flow to deficit regions and no one has strategic reserves, and it's all orders are made to delivery, very short time periods between transport from one region to another. Just in case system would probably look more like a lot of strategic reserves that countries have, less dependence on free trade for imports, but then again, it's difficult. And then sorry, just a general redundancy through the supply chain. So you'd want a system where if one node went down, so the choke points Richard talked to us about, if one node sort of was cut off, then we could still operate. But there's still quite a lot of dispute to whether having redundancies and reserves is actually that beneficial versus a pure free trade model. There was a kind of a disagreement with different stakeholders, particularly people that came from more pro-trade organizations obviously said, well, we need more trade, more open trade. Individuals from particularly governments were keen to talk about domestic production and strategic stockpiles of commodities. And then in the literature, again, there seems to be a disagreement. There's a bit of an uncertainty there. So that's perhaps an area of research going forward. And then just finally on the regulatory side of it, I'm not really sure myself specifically. We haven't really got to the deep into the policy aspect of this research yet. However, I would just point people towards the communications from March earlier this year out of the EU on their food security contingency plans in 2022. Lots of discussions about reducing import dependency, strategic autonomy of the EU, and things like that. So that might give you some indication. Thank you.
I don't know if Emily, you want to add something or?
Yeah, similar. So I can just add a little bit in the context of the soy supply chain. I would say that just in case would look like, firstly, like Joe mentioned, having more storage at different points within the supply chain and spread out, which would probably increase costs. And I think that's the trade-off that has to happen there. And then the other thing, just in case supply chain might do is, again, be less efficient in terms of not just having one main protein source like soy, but maybe diversifying into other protein sources more in anticipation of potential shocks in the future.
Okay, so I have one question that, again, for both of you, I think this is the question that everyone would have raised, which is, did you have so what is the role of climate change during your interview that does it emerge as an important stressor or not, or more important than others? So what is the role played by the climate change issue in your interview, in the replies to your interview, to your question or the exit of the interviews?
Do you want me to go first, Emily?
Yes.
Yeah. So we had a specific question about that, actually, asking stakeholders what are the most important issues facing the EU food system and things like that, and pretty much everyone said climate change is number one by far. Some individuals mentioned war and conflict, but perhaps that's more just because that's been sort of on everyone's agenda this year. But yeah, climate change came up far and above other issues, because particularly if you're in crop production, distribution, supermarkets, these types of shocks that are going to be increasingly defining the sort of paradigm going forward is something everyone needs to be aware of. So that very much came through in the interviews, that climate change was the most important factor.
Okay, Emily, 2 minutes, because then in the last minute I want to thank everyone and also give the result of the poll. So if you
Yeah, so not too much to add really. Also, similarly, in the soy interviews, climate change was widely acknowledged to be one of the major shocks. But having said that, it was also with a backdrop of lots of other shocks going on. And I guess where they expected the most concerning things to happen in the future was where these things intersected. So not just a climate event and not just a geopolitical event, but all those things happening at the same time. And also the fact that climate change is a long-term kind of set of shocks and a worsening thing something that we expect to worsen in the future as well.
Okay, so let me first of all, the result of the poll basically has been confirmed. The previous exits, also with more people having the opportunity to answer. So we have okay, that was on the climate impacts. Okay, so changing production, agricultural commodities, and the interruption of key trade nodes were the two most concerning type of impact that could transmit effect to the EU. Okay, so thank you for. Let me thank all our presenter, all our audience for being with us for this event. Of course, we are also very grateful to Chatham House for hosting us. And again, I iterate the invitation to visit the Cascades project website, where there are very interesting material and documentation and the deliverable results. And of course, if you are interested, I think it's quite easy to contact us by email or other means, or through perhaps the Cascades website, so to have more information about the project and what we are doing. So with that said, really thank you a lot for the attention, the participation, and also to the presenter again for the very interesting presentation. But I shouldn't say that, being one of the the chair and the presenter of the session. Okay, so thank you very much. I think that we are going to close in some seconds. So hope to see you all at the next COP.